In Screencast 3, we're going to consider the second of our determinants of demand, which is income. And in thinking about income, we need to just remember our kind of simple definition of demand, which is demand can be thought of as the willingness and the ability of an individual or group of individuals to buy a good or a service at a given price. So when we're talking about income, budget, the amount of income one has is a major constraint or determinant of the demand for a product. So income and the amount of income that a consumer has is a major determinant. And one of the key issues that we talk about when we consider income as a determinant is income elasticity of demand. Now, just as price elasticity of demand measured the responsiveness of quantity demanded to a change in price, income elasticity measures the responsiveness of quantity demanded to a change in income. And the formula for measuring this is percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in income. Now, what income elasticity of demand allows us to do is it allows us to categorize goods into different groups, or to group goods into different categories. And this chart here shows us luxury, normal and inferior goods in economic terms. So what do these terms mean? Well, here we see a chart, and do be aware that the chart axes have switched here. Whereas when we looked at price, we had quantity demanded along this axis, and we had price here. Here we've got the quantity demanded on this axis and change in income here. And let's start off with looking at a superior good. So a superior good is a good which has an income elasticity greater than 1. And what this shows us, so this kind of superior good shows us that as incomes change by 1%, say, the demand for that good would increase by more than 1%. So a superior good, as incomes increase, the consumer decides to spend a higher proportion of its income on that particular good. And these kinds of goods generate high levels of income elasticity. Okay. A normal good has a kind of less steep curve. So we can see here, as income rises, the gradient of this curve actually increases. What we can see here is that as incomes increase, demand increases, but we don't have a kind of steepness, a graduated steepness of curve that we have here. So what we can see is that income elasticity is less than 1, but greater than 0. So for a normal good, as incomes rise, consumers will spend more on the good, but it won't necessarily keep up with the rise in increases in demand. Okay. And what we can see here is a negative income curve, a negative income elasticity schedule in red here. And this is the kind of demand schedule for an inferior good. And inferior goods are those goods for which demand decreases as incomes increase. And this could be because these inferior goods are being substituted for luxury or superior goods. Now, generally, sport is seen, and when some evidence is looked at, sport is seen as a luxury or a superior good, in that it is income elastic. So going back to our first week of lectures and our second week of lectures, when we looked at evidence for the relationship between incomes across Europe and the size of leisure and sport, well, the size of the sport economy in those different European countries, the evidence that allows us to say that sport is a superior good is the fact that countries with a higher GDP and GDP per head of population had a higher level of sport consumer spending per head of population than those economies with lower GDP per head of population. So this led us to say that across the European community, certainly, sport is seen as, sport can be classified as a luxury or a superior good, because consumption of sport, as evidenced by the size of the sport economy in a country, increases as incomes rise across the EU nations. Okay. Now, the US could be slightly different, although last week we looked at demand for leisure time rather than spending on sport. So don't think that, that the thing that we looked at last week, where the US demand for leisure time was relatively low, is the same as spending on sport, because they're not necessarily the same thing. What we might find is that in the US economy, which has a higher GDP per head of population than many European countries, though not all European countries, that spending on sport is actually money intensive rather than time intensive, and that sport in the US could also be a superior good, although I haven't seen evidence on that. And we can also see that, there is evidence that, for example, football tickets benefit from a kind of from a kind of high level of income elasticity, which is that demand for football tickets increases as incomes rise. Okay, so that is the theory. What about some evidence? Well, rather than talk to you about many different examples from participation sport, I'm going to set you an individual learning task that I'd like you to try to do. It's not essential that you do this before the seminar this week, but it might be useful if you do it at some stage, because this will allow you to look at the relationship between the income that somebody earns and their propensity to participate in a sport. So I have developed or recorded a mini screencast for you, during which I show you how to build a query using an active live survey. And the active live survey is the current survey which is carried out in England by Sport England, which measures participation in different sports. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do is, having looked at the screencast, to build your own query to investigate the link between income, and for income we're going to use a proxy of socio-economic group. So remember, socio-economic group groups people into types of professions, and different types of professions will have different income levels. So the higher socio-economic groups, A, B, will tend to have higher incomes than lower socio-economic groups, so C, D and E. Okay, so we're going to look at this and consider participation for a range of sports by socio-economic group, and you're going to build a query to do this. Now, you can choose your own sports, but I'm suggesting that you look at these sports listed here: angling, golf, athletics, football, tennis, hockey, cricket and basketball. And as you do this, I'd ask you to think, what patterns can you see in terms of the relationship between income and socio-economic group? And how does this relate to the concept of income elasticity? Okay. Now, again, there will be reading which you can carry out at the end of or between this week and next week's seminars, which will allow you to consider evidence on income elasticity of demand for certain sports goods, products or services, probably ones related to the sector of the industry or the area of the business that you're going to do your assignment on. But in terms of the theory, and that's the role of the lecture today, that's all I'm going to say about income. And next, we're going to move on to the price of other goods, which is really about the availability of substitutes and complements.